back from me, white devils.
Okay, so we're starting off with some pretty loaded language here. The big problem that I have with a lot of these woke posts, they just throw out a bunch of trigger words and concepts. I honestly don't understand how this is even contested anymore. But don't worry, there's still plenty to go over. What's happening, guys? My name is Jordan and welcome to Let's Be Real. This is my first YouTube video in a while and I'm super excited to be starting this up again. For my first video, I wanted to talk about a little graphic that I found on Twitter. Woke religion, a taxonomy. Oh boy. You see, a big problem that I have with a lot of these woke posts is that rarely do they ever address the arguments being made by the people they're trying to criticize. They just throw out a bunch of trigger words and concepts that they know are going to make their culture warrior base mad, and then try to pass that off like it's truth. Now, I could spend hours going through every section on this little chart, but I don't want to bore you on the first video, so I'm only going to be looking at the first three. But don't worry, there's still plenty to go over. So for a little bit of context, the creators of this graphic were clearly trying to equate progressive ideologies and activism with religious tenets and experiences. As such, each progressive slogan or idiom or talking point has been categorized with its religious equivalent. Category number 1, racism, original sin, slavery, and the guilty devils, white people, and the police. Okay, so we're starting off with some pretty loaded language here.
Original sin. Get back from me, white devils.
Okay, calm down, Beelzebub. I honestly don't understand how this is even contested anymore. Any look at history will show that the chattel slave trade was undoubtedly the impetus for many of the racial problems we see in America today. And the effects of that racism through slavery have been a ripple that have infected many of our governing institutions. For example, the United States police and criminal justice system. Myths: the United States War for Independence was fought to maintain slavery. This assertion is from one of the articles in the 1619 Project, which is an academic body of work published by the New York Times that reframes the establishment and founding of what America is today through the lens of its racial history and racial problems. 1619 being the year that the first African slaves were brought over to the colonies. Now, while the project as a whole has been broadly considered by historians to be accurate, there are parts of it that are contested. And there's an interesting article on Politico written by one of the fact checkers explaining why she disagrees with this interpretation. But there are plenty of other historians who think that this is a perfectly justifiable lens. The simple misconception about the 1619 Project is that it is a series of conclusions about America, when in fact what it is a lens of analysis. Many history professors and educators have expressed that they want to teach the 1619 Project alongside their normal courses on American history. There's a lot of discussion that goes on about the racial impact of slavery in the Americas and on its culture. And to frame this as some sort of immutable religious belief is just not accurate. Structural racism is the cause for all racial inequality and the only explanation possible for disparate outcomes by racial group. Don't strawman me now. Nobody says it's the reason for all inequality, and nobody says it's the only explanation for the disparate outcomes by racial group. It's just most of the reason. And there are hundreds of studies supporting this. But as long as we're talking about mythology here, I'll take a stab at it. Despite innumerable studies outlining racial discrimination in our systems of power, conservatives and reactionaries are absolutely allergic to admitting that there could be any type of racial or systemic oppression of marginalized groups in our society. Well, not all marginalized groups are oppressed. There are some exceptions. Asian success is due to Asians participating in white supremacy. Yeah, sometimes. There are plenty of Asian people who support white supremacist policies and bolster white supremacist talking points in order to maintain their place in the social hierarchy. But the truth behind that assertion yields a way more interesting answer. A few years ago, an economist at Brown University did some research into the claim that the reason that Asian Americans had surpassed black and even white Americans as far as income was because of their traditional, intact families, and the fact that education was prominent. The first major wave of Asian immigration to the US was in the 1900s when thousands of Chinese laborers came over to help work on the railroads. Based on old census data and public opinion polls, it seems like the white population was just as prejudiced towards Asians as they were blacks. Federal policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the complete banning of immigration from Asian nations in 1924 showed a pretty hostile response from the American government as well. Like blacks, Asians were segregated to their own communities and their own schools and had to open up their own businesses because nobody would hire them. That is, until around the 1960s when Asians began to close the wealth gap. In 1965, a change in the political climate allowed for a surge of high-skilled, high-earning Asian immigrants to come over to the United States. By the census of 1970, Asians were earning just as much money as whites, and by 1980, they were out-earning them. Now, I wonder what was going on during the 60s and early 70s that might have incentivized the political power structure of the time to drive an economic wedge between black and Asian people. Rioting and looting are political acts. Yes, unironically. Rioting, looting, and destruction of property can absolutely be methods of getting your political point across. And if you don't believe me, I've got some American patriots who would love to have a chat. We never discuss slavery in the history of racism. What imaginary planet are you people living on? Yes, we have to talk about slavery in the history of racism constantly. Because the nanosecond we stop talking about it, conservatives either try to erase it from textbooks or pretend that we were all singing zippity-doo-dah. I think I've made my point here. The purpose of this category is to delegitimize the actual arguments and concerns of anti-racism advocates by framing them as these fantastical myths that could never be real. But as I hope I've shown, most of those arguments are pretty well substantiated. Moving on to category number 2. Climate change. The guilty devils here are Exxon, BP, and the fossil fuel industry. Climate deniers, Monsanto, the Koch brother. Okay, wait a minute. Are we being serious right now? The primary contributors to global pollution and destruction of the environment aren't responsible for climate change? But okay, maybe I'm jumping the gun. Let's see if this gets more reasonable. Woke religion's climate change myths. The Earth's climate was safer in the past. That's objectively correct? The Earth's climate was probably better when we weren't pumping toxic gas into the ozone layer, or pumping it into the earth and causing earthquakes, or cutting down entire forests, which reduces the Earth's ability to get rid of greenhouse gases, as well as destroying entire animal ecosystems and the homes of indigenous people. So if by safer you mean the climate wasn't as bad because we weren't doing those things to the same degree that we are today, then yeah, it was a lot safer. Climate change is making natural disasters deadlier and more expensive. Seems to be the case, yeah. Climate change is the main cause of high-intensity forest fires. Science seems to check out on that one too. You know, saying the correct thing in a mocking voice doesn't make it less correct, right? Human civilization is unsustainable. Alright, so I'm going to inject some actual religiosity into this discussion. I'm a Christian. And I know that a good portion of the people who are going to be liking and sharing and retweeting this little rubric are going to be conservative Christians. Now, I've read my Bible, and it makes it pretty clear that this world is falling apart. Wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famine in diverse places and whatnot. And the Bible also makes it very clear that it is because of the sinful nature of man that this is happening. So from a Christian perspective, yes! Human sin and civilization is destroying the planet, and the science seems to be backing that up. But Christians are the ones making fun of the idea that climate change is destroying the planet. Are you really going to ignore biblical truths supported and verified by empirical, real-world science because you don't want to be woke? Moving on. The elect, those who have been chosen to make things right. Climate scientists, activists, and journalists. I see we have some anti-intellectualism going on here. One of the hallmarks of reactionary thought. I think we're done here. Moving on to our third and final category, transgender people. Ooh, I can already tell this is gonna be good. Woke transgender religious myths. Trans women or trans men are identical to biological women or biological men. So, unless you get all of your data from Twitter, which I'm starting to believe that the creators of this graphic must have, transgender people on the whole do not believe that they are biologically the same as cisgender people. There are absolutely differences. Violence against trans people is on the rise, disproportionate, and due to being trans. Again, being correct in a dumb voice doesn't make it not true. But here's the part that I really don't get about this myth. Y'all don't like trans people. You support groups that don't like trans people and are most likely to commit violence against trans people. So why would you try and pass off the fact that trans people experience violence as some sort of woke myth? I'm not even going to get into how you guys don't understand how puberty blockers work or how gender identification works, because that's not what any of this stupid graphic is about. The only point of this graphic is to try and discredit progressive arguments and ideas by misrepresenting them as some sort of woke religious extremism. And the funniest part is that under any other circumstances, conservatives would be chomping at the bit to sanctify anyone who was brave enough to stand up for their religious convictions. Unless, of course, those convictions involved helping marginalized groups or challenging the hierarchy. I think I remember reading about a guy who did that a while ago. Nah, he was probably just too woke.